The Drive-In Movie Feature Review is now called the Movie Marquee. Thank you for stopping by at the Drive-In Feature Movie Review Podcast. Our podcast reviews well-known movies and contains spoilers. The podcast may contain mature subject matter and mature language. Listener discretion is advised. Enjoy the show.
Quiet on set. Places, everybody. And action.
Welcome, everybody, to the Drive-In Feature Movie Review Podcast. I am Ted, and I can't do that, Dave. And with me, I have my intrepid space travelers, Eric.
The mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
That it is. And, of course, we have Ken with us, too.
Dave, I'm afraid.
You probably should be, Ken. You probably should be.
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
So today, we're going to be reviewing 2001: A Space Odyssey. Eric, do you have the particulars of 2001: A Space Odyssey?
Yes, I do. So 2001 Space Odyssey is starring Keir Dullea as Dr. Dave Bowman. Gary Lockwood is Dr. Frank Poole. William Sylvester is Dr. Haywood R. Floyd. Daniel Richter as Moonwatcher. And Douglas Rain as HAL 9000. So this movie was officially released on April 2nd, 1968 to a very small amount of theaters in the U.S., some of the major market cities, and it had a lot of changes to the movie. Some scenes were cut out. Some of the particulars of how the movie was viewed and audio were changed. But its general release was in the fall of 1968. It had a $12 million budget, and it had a worldwide gross of about $72 million. Not too bad, and that does not include the video and anything from today. The movie was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, Best Production Design, and Best Visual Effects, but unfortunately it only won for Best Visual Effects.
Yeah, we don't want to talk about that. That's a travesty. So at the time, Eric, what did the critics have to say about 2001?
Well, it's very interesting. When this movie was released in 1968, the critics were much different than they were by today's standards. You did not have all the online reviews and all the people out there to just give their 2 cents. It was very regimented magazines and newspapers that were giving the reviews. And the reviews, unfortunately, were not too good. The New York Times said that this movie was somewhere between hypnotic and immensely boring. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was a historian, a social critic, and a public intellectual of the time, very well respected in a lot of the political campaigns of the era, called the movie morally pretentious, intellectually obscure, and inordinately long, a film out of control. Variety magazine called it big, beautiful, but plotting, sci-fi epic, superb photography, major asset, but too confusing, long, unfolding plot, but should do biz in initial release. Should do biz, I guess business, in the initial release. Harper's Magazine called it a monumentally unimaginative movie. Ooh, that's harsh.
Wow.
Newsday, Space Odyssey fails most gloriously. And this one was very interesting. Some of the research I did on this movie, when it came out, a lot of the movie houses were going to pull it. But then they said that a lot of the younger crowds started kind of coming in later, and they started getting high while they were watching the movie. One of the real positive reviews of the day, ironically enough, came from the Christian Science Monitor, who we know is a big political magazine. They called 2001 is the ultimate trip. That's so awesome for 1968. Roger Ebert actually saw this movie in its first run in 1968 in Los Angeles at one of the movie reviews, and he called it a Kubrick masterpiece. 4 stars. Rotten Tomatoes, certified fresh at 92% and an audience score of 89. That's pretty impressive. The reviews actually later are much better. I don't really have any of them, but a lot of the online reviews, people really appreciated the movie after they had a chance to really mull it over for a couple years.
Was it the New York Times critic who, like 2 or 3 years later, came back and actually apologized for his initial review?
That's exactly
of the
right.
movie.
A lot of the reviewers probably did the same thing after. I mean, let's think about it. It's 1968. It was, the first 30 minutes of movie had no dialogue whatsoever. If you're a movie reviewer and you're watching this, you're probably thinking to yourself, why aren't they talking? What's going on here? And I'm sure
Right.
that tainted the initial reviews.
Oh, I'm sure. So, Ken, can you give us the plot for 2001: A Space Odyssey?
Yes, I can, Ted. Space, the final frontier. Oh, sorry, wrong movie.
Wrong movie.
Okay, here's the plot. In prehistoric time, a tribe of monkeys are driven away from their waterhole by a rival tribe. Later, they are awakened to find an alien monolith has appeared before them and influences them. They discover how to use a bone as a weapon, and after their first hunt, return to drive the rivals away with their newly discovered tool. Millions of years later, Dr. Haywood Floyd, chairman of the United States National Council of Astronautics, travels to the U.S. lunar outpost. During a stopover at Space Station 5, he meets Russian scientists who are concerned about the outpost. Floyd refuses to discuss rumors of an epidemic at the base. Continuing his journey to the outpost, Floyd addresses a meeting of personnel to whom he stresses the need for secrecy and respect to the newest discovery. Floyd's mission is to investigate a recently found artifact buried 4 million years ago near the crater Tycho. Floyd and others ride in a moon bus to the artifact, which is the monolith, identical to the one encountered by the ape men. As they examine the monolith, it is struck by sunlight, upon which emits a high-powered radio signal. 18 months later, the United States spacecraft Discovery 1 is bound for Jupiter. On board are mission pilots Dr. David Bowman and Dr. Frank Poole, along with 3 other scientists in suspended animation. Most of Discovery's operations are controlled by HAL, a HAL 9000 computer with a human personality. A conversation between HAL and Bowman is interrupted when HAL reports the imminent failure of an antenna control device. The astronauts retrieve it but find nothing wrong. Hal suggests reinstalling the device and letting it fail so the problem can be verified. Mission Control advises the astronauts that the results from their own HAL 9000 computer indicate that HAL is in error. Hal attributes the discrepancy to human error. Concerned about Hal's behavior, Bowman and Poole enter a pod to talk about Hal without him overhearing, and agree to disconnect Hal if he's proven wrong. Hal follows the conversation by lip reading. While Poole is on a spacewalk outside attempting to replace the antenna, Hal takes control of the pod and severs Poole's oxygen hose and sets him adrift. Bowman takes another pod to rescue Poole. While he's outside, Hal turns off the life support functions of the crewmen in suspended animation, thereby killing them. When Bowman returns to the ship with Poole's body, Hal refuses to let him in, saying, "I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid. I can't do that." Hal states that the astronauts' plan to deactivate him jeopardizes the mission. Bowman opens the ship's emergency airlock manually, enters the ship, and proceeds to Hal's processing core, where he begins disconnecting Hal's circuits. Hal tries to reassure Bowman and then pleads with him to stop, and then expresses fear. When the disconnection is complete, pre-recorded video message plays, revealing that the mission's objective is to investigate the radio signals sent from the monolith to Jupiter. At Jupiter, Bowman finds a third, much larger monolith orbiting the planet. He leaves Discovery in a pod to investigate, but is pulled into a vortex of colored light. Bowman is carried across vast distances of space while viewing bizarre cosmological phenomenon and strange landscapes of unusual colors. Eventually, he finds himself in a large bedroom where he sees and then becomes older versions of himself. First standing in the bedroom, middle-aged and still in his spacesuit, then dressed in leisure attire and eating dinner. And finally, as an old man lying on a bed, a monolith appears at the foot of the bed, and as Bowman reaches for it, he is transformed into a space baby, enclosed in a transparent orb of light, which floats in space beside the Earth. The end. More dialogue than probably the movie.
You're probably right. But that was a really good summation of the movie, Ken. So to get us started here, the movie has 3 distinct parts: The Dawn of Man, The Jupiter Mission, and Into the Infinite. Starting with The Dawn of Man is probably the best place to start because it's probably the easiest place to start. What do you make of the first part of the movie?
First of all, if you watch the Blu-ray or even probably the newest DVD, you have about 3 minutes of weird music that starts even before the MGM logo even appears. You have to check to see if your TV is even working properly. It's a strange kind of sound, and to hear 3 minutes of it is kind of strange. But then you have the epic, what is it called?
Thus spake Zarathustra.
So when they finally start the movie and you hear that music that's so iconic, you're getting excited. But then to be perfectly honest with you, you have to really be watching and investing into this portion of the movie because there is no dialogue. You need to figure out all the things that are happening. And I see a lot of interesting things happening, but I just feel like I'm detached already from the movie, maybe because of how long it's already been taken for the monkeys to even appear into the movie.
That is true. It's definitely a hard movie to digest from the beginning. You really have to know what you're expecting. But honestly, you have to have it that way in the beginning. You can't have the monkeys being like Planet of the Apes talking with British accents. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, he's making his movie to be as realistic as possible. And realism at that time, as we probably see it, are them just, screaming and just going ape, for lack of a better word. Yeah, it probably was drawn out a lot longer than it has to be. I think it was 30 minutes before we had the first words by an actor. So for 30 minutes, you're literally listening to these apes just going ape and screaming and what have you. But I can't see how else you would do it to keep it realistic like that.
I see why you had some critics have to redo their review of this movie because this takes multiple watches for you to really, I think, invest, especially the first third of the movie.
Oh, clearly multiple watches. Clearly.
I stopwatched this at 21 minutes before there is actual dialogue in the movie. But there's things that I was looking at. Is this actually Earth? The surroundings looks very familiar to the surroundings of the monolith later on in the film. Is this actually Earth, or maybe is this another location altogether? So those are things that I questioned just watching the movie without listening to other people talk about this movie. But it does seem like they're peaceful for the most part. There's a lot of animals getting along with animals. They look like they're vegetarians before the monolith even shows up. So it's a different society. They have that pool of water that they're fighting over with the other apes, but in general, they somehow make it work. They're not happy to share it with this other tribe, but they're making it happen. But then you have this monolith come in, and all of a sudden everything changes. They find the bone, and they know now the bone is destructive, and now they can say, well, this is ours. Get away from our water. And they actually end up killing one of the other monkeys. And basically, now you have the Democrats and the Republicans are against each other.
Okay. Wow.
Interesting. But you did tackle some things there that I've tackled too, as far as the beginning. I also, too, for the longest time, wondered if this was supposed to be Earth. But at the end of the day, it is, because it's the dawn of man. The thing that catches me with the beginning of the movie all the time is when the monolith does appear and all of the apes touch the monolith, and then all of a sudden they do have a dramatic change of reasoning.
They gain knowledge from the monolith.
Right.
It's like the apple from the tree in Adam and Eve in Genesis. It's all of a sudden everything has changed in their life once they've taken part of that.
Right. They've achieved a new sense of enlightenment that they hadn't had before. Well, I find the whole movie interesting, but one of the things that I find interesting about the beginning of the movie is when the ape who figures this out is called Moonwatcher.
Moonwatcher.
When he throws the bone in the air and then it transforms into the defense nuclear satellite. For the longest time, I didn't know what that was supposed to be.
Exactly. So some of these things you don't even know what they are. If you're just a regular moviegoer watching this, you don't know the transition there from one scene to the other. You don't know what the connection is. And I think that's one of the problems with this movie for me is I almost have to hear other people talk about this movie almost for me to understand, some of the cool things that I'm missing here.
And that's definitely true. But yeah, it's that transition from one weapon to another. I did read that there are different schools of thought about the beginning of the movie as far as whether or not it's 4 sections and not 3. It's been definitively discussed that when Floyd is going to the space station, that is still the dawn of man, because we've not achieved the next level of enlightenment or advancement. We've advanced far from the ape man at the beginning to Floyd traveling into the space station. But it really is still the dawn of man.
I'm very happy to find out that Howard Johnson's has made a comeback in 2001.
Oh, I know, right?
Howard Johnson's and Pan Am, too.
And Hilton and Ma Bell.
Right.
In this instance, I think product placement is important. I know sometimes you hate product placement in movies, but I think this makes it more realistic.
Well, think back what was going on here in between 1965 and 1968 when this movie was started and when it was released. Howard Johnson, big name.
Oh, they're huge. They're all huge.
They're all huge. And so they think that they're going to still be huge in 2001, but by 2001,
they're done.
They're gone. It's kind of funny.
What it does in this case, it allows the person watching the movie to have a personal connection to that portion of the movie. Because a person then can relate, oh, hey, I know the Hilton name, and I know Howard Johnson's, and I know, of course, Ma Bell, and I know these different things.
And then you add Pan American.
Right.
Yeah.
And so people would have had instant connection to, oh, hey, I know that. Look at what they've done. And at the time, if you look at when this was made, we were still advancing by leaps and bounds. And it wasn't out of the realm of imagination. I mean, you look even on TV as something as innocent as a TV show like The Jetsons. And that was supposed to be set, in 1984? We were going to have flying cars and things of that nature because we were undergoing such a transformation in technology and advancement. It was in the realm of possibility that, hey, that Pan Am could be the company that takes us to the next level and revolutionizes space travel in that way because they were one of the first purveyors of the airplane industry for using the airplane for personal leisure travel.
I'm wondering why they, though, still had those pink outfits for the stewardess. Couldn't they have gotten rid of those pink outfits by 2001?
Well, a lot of it, I mean, if you looked at a lot of the interiors, even when all the scientists were meeting there, everything was white and you had these big red chairs. And then when they were in the meeting room, the aesthetics were very, very late 1960s. And when you look at futuristic movies that are done in the 1960s, look at some of the TV shows from the 70s. I mean, like Buck Rogers, what is it, in the 25th century?
Right.
It looks like Buck Rogers in 1979. Let's be honest. It's really campy, but a lot of the documentaries I watched has made some really good points about the aesthetics of 2001, where in the 60s, space travel, we were, like Ted said, leaps and bounds. We were moving, for lack of a better phrase, at the speed of light from Kennedy in 1961 to the quote-unquote moon landing in 1969. We were just moving really, really fast with competition with the Russians. It was the Vietnam War that slowed down our space exploration process. And then even when we started going back with the space shuttles in the 80s, some great points were made. By the time the mid 80s or the early 80s rolled around and they were 15 launches in, Americans got bored. They have short attention spans and they were bored with space travel already. They were saying that NASA had to pay the networks money to actually show these launches. That's how bored the American public got. And I thought that was just a horrible commentary on Americans in general. Very realistically speaking, by the time this movie was made, very feasible that we would be having commercial flights in space and we would be having space stations and we would be having the public just flying around as they would here on Earth.
Right.
It's very believable at that time.
It is. It really is. And what you said is such an indictment on the human element that we would become bored with something as monumental as space travel and leaving our orbit to go to the moon. It just is mind-blowing. It defies, I can barely even form the words to how disappointing that really is.
I want to go back to the Dawn of Man segment. When we talked about enlightenment, why does enlightenment mean all of a sudden, this is mine, not yours, and I will kill you for it? So right away, they see this, admiring this monolith, and it changes them, it enlightens them. But what we see next, though, is that they become hunters and then they become killers. Is that enlightenment? Why did it go straight to that?
You made a good point when it came to the apple and Adam and Eve in Genesis. I mean, it's a very, very close relation to them opening their eyes. And, the monolith itself could be construed as a god figure. As I was watching this movie, you've got all these apes wandering around aimlessly on a planet, not doing a lot. And then you have this big brother figure, if you will, this monolith that appears out of nowhere, and they all touch it. And now knowledge is expressed to them. Good or bad, it's expressed to them, and they evolve, if you will, into a society that's hunters, gatherers, killers, meat eaters. Good or bad, they are evolving, and then they keep evolving, and then we roll into 2001 on the spaceship.
Maybe enlightenment, I shouldn't have used necessarily that word, but it's a different type of enlightenment. It's the moment that the ape learned to use a tool. And it's human nature, as we've seen, what humans will do to each other when we do have a tool. Murder is one of the things that, unfortunately, is part of the nature that will happen in some people. But I think more or less, it's the moment where ape had that higher level of thought for the first time. There's something that they can use a tool that allows them to achieve the next stage of evolution, essentially.
If you look at earlier, you see, I believe is it a mountain lion that attacks one of the
Or
apes?
it's a cheetah.
It's a cheetah. And he attacks one of the apes, and we assume that didn't go well for the ape.
Well, that's because the cheetah is the fastest land animal on Earth.
Yeah, the cheetah. But I'm thinking, is the Enlightenment a way to survive? How long could they survive doing what they were doing based on how they were? I mean, when we look at them, they're vegetarians. My opinion on vegetarians. Maybe giving them that insight allows them to grow, maybe without murder, maybe without understanding. You can't grow, and they would eventually have died out based on what this movie's trying to do.
Essentially, you are exactly right. That's where Darwin's survival of the fittest, it's in its most primitive point, what they're depicting there. I think when the bone turns into the nuclear weapons satellite, it shows that even now, not a whole lot has changed as far as human nature goes, because we've taken something like space travel and we've weaponized it. And I think that says a lot about the human nature, that we do find ways to destroy.
In the movie, though, when they do switch over to the modern age or whatever you want to call it, there's no indication that there's any wars or that there's any battles or anything like that going on. Yes, maybe there is a weapon right there, but outside of that, like you even said earlier, we don't know what that is. We don't know that there's all these wars. It sounds like it's very peaceful and everybody is just investing in, it's like almost like that Star Trek universe where it's for the good of man now.
The Cold War is over because Floyd has a conversation with the 3 Russian scientists on the space station. So obviously that portion of the Cold War is over. And there has been a human understanding. Floyd is part of the council, and you get the feeling that that council is an international council. So there is more understanding, and especially knowing that the Cold War has died. It almost makes the inference that space travel is what ended the tensions, and that's what brought people together, which is interesting. What you're seeing with the apes is you're seeing the first moment that essentially turned from an ape into what we would consider a man at that point, is that higher level of reasoning and thought. I think that's what they mean by the dawn of man, is when that next level of enlightenment, and as I use enlightenment again, that, wow, hey, there is plenty of discussions to be had about the monolith. What does it symbolize at that point? Because is that extraterrestrial intelligence helping advance humanity into getting into the next stage of evolution? If you talk to some of the ancient alien theorists that are out there, the History Channel has made a buku money over the ancient alien theory. That is something that can definitely be discussed there. But that's a whole nother conversation, because the monolith could represent a lot of different things at that point.
It could be a number of different things. You could even talk about being a godlike figure. God is interfering into the human race at a particular time to advance the human race. Any way you look at it, even if it's E.T. coming down to make changes, it is kind of a godlike process because the monolith has taken upon itself to advance the human race or to make changes to the human race. And to me, based on that, that's a godlike figure.
Yeah, it definitely seems that there's some sort of interference that has been made on behalf to advance us to the next level of evolution. And that leads us to them then finding a similar monolith that's been buried on the moon for 4 million years, which is a radio transmitter into deep space.
Because if you're saying that's 4 million years old, and we're saying the Earth is probably 4 million years old, is what we're saying here, basically, from my understanding. They're interacting with each other, because this is being buried in a Jupiter moon far, far away, and then you have the one on Earth, supposedly, probably communicating with each other in some type of way.
Did we ever find out in the movie how they came across the monolith on the moon? Was it a construction project, or how did they ever find it?
Yeah, it was a construction project, and then they got this. I can't remember exactly how he describes it, but the scientist says it wasn't necessarily a signal, but they found something there through excavation. So they were making an additional base or something at that location, and they found this. It's quite shocking.
Well, the monolith probably wanted to be found, let's be honest. There's probably monoliths all over the universe. Like you said, 4 million, it's probably buried on the moon for 4 million years. There's one that's probably on Earth or sporadically throughout Earth that eventually, after the dawn of man with the apes, is buried amongst the layers and layers of sediment. You've got the one on Jupiter sending the signal.
Right.
Very godlike in controlling the actions of the
I
people.
think a guy was just out there with a metal detector and stumbled upon it.
Of course. Of course.
It makes it interesting. That's an interesting thought. We can unpack this now. We are, in a sense, the monolith itself. To me, it's meant different things since I've first seen the movie and as I've moved into my 40s. It's meant something to me at different times. It meant to me when I first saw it as that point of enlightenment. But now, looking at it, I think it is put there by some sort of extraterrestrial intelligence that we have not encountered at all. That's an interesting theory. It's allowing us to achieve other things. And I hate to go off on the ancient alien theory, but if you look at what happened in the 20th century and into the 21st century, at the beginning of the 20th century, we were talking together through Morse code, through a telegraph. And by the end of the 20th century, we were on cellular phones. That's a huge jump in, I don't know, is it evolution or in thought? There seemed to be an explosion of advancement through the 20th century that seems almost unprecedented, but here again, I wasn't alive, or we weren't alive, when men were coming back on boats from strange lands that they had found across the sea. It seems that there was this great movement of intelligence in the 20th century, and that's kind of what ultimately now the monolith represents to me, is that maybe it was an extraterrestrial type of intelligence that influenced these apes and then influenced the next level of ape, which was us on the moon, to search for interspace travel. But just as a couple of things, if you're watching the movie, in 18 months after they find the monolith on the moon, man has figured out the hibernation, intergalactical communication, because they're communicating from close to Jupiter all the way to Earth. And they figured out a manned space shuttle to travel into deep space. So there had to be some sort of transfer of intelligence when they're on the moon and the radio signal goes out, because there has to be a connection, because the ape touches the monolith on Earth and then achieves another plane of thought, and then Haywood Floyd touches the monolith, and then 18 months later, we're traveling to Jupiter.
Oh, I agree, 100%. Touching the monolith is giving knowledge to whoever touches it.
Well, and the monolith, we find out, doesn't like its picture being taken. So,
right.
Because it gives out that burst of radio signal that everybody is shrieking in pain from the sound, which makes me wonder what happened, because we don't see what happens to them. We assume that they're okay because then we see the doctor later in that video stating what the mission is.
Right. The monolith is one of those devices, and I've went through periods of hating it and loving it, because I usually want to know everything I can about the movie, especially something that sparks my interest like this movie did, a lot of it's open to interpretation.
I think that's how he wanted it.
And I think so too. It allows you to go search different things and different ideas. Later, we'll talk about the Star Child and what that represents. But the monolith is so important because Dave achieves another level of human advancement as well, because he travels through this portal that it's hard to describe because we've moved from intergalactic travel to the wider space. The closest determination to what it would be a wormhole outside of Jupiter, where the last monolith they encounter is in orbit around Jupiter.
Yeah, I can see that. I would agree with that.
Is this a dream, though? Or I shouldn't say, is this a dream? The question here is, does Dave just go through all this and experience all this and then it's over for Dave? Or does this come back to Dave and Dave has now this knowledge that he can now share with others? For me, that's taking 2010 out of the equation, the movie sequel, which is not half bad, but at the same time, probably not needed as well. The question here is, what has Dave just experienced? Is he looking outside, experiencing all this, and does he bring it back, or is Dave now reborn and nobody knows what happened to Dave?
You're leaving that one open to interpretation as well.
And that'll lead us into the discussion of the Star Child at the end. But before we stop on to the end of the movie, there is the middle part of the movie where we have to deal with the Jupiter mission.
You're right, we have to deal with it.
We have to.
Right? Because there's a lot to unpack here, because we've created artificial intelligence in HAL that is really scary as how accurate it is. And I definitely want to discuss that later as well, about how accurate HAL is as far as artificial intelligence goes. But he serves too as a superior being, or believes he's a superior being to Frank and Dave. But he can't handle the logical fallacy that was given to him, because he was essentially given two different missions. He was told to hide vital information from Frank and Dave.
Right, he's in conflict. He wants to share that with Dave. He wants to share that. You could tell when he's asking him questions about the mission.
Yeah.
You know that he wants to share with him what he knows, but he can't. And that makes it very interesting, the kind of computer that he is. Because we are asking, is Hal alive?
Is Hal himself evolving and learning?
And struggling.
Yeah.
Struggling with conflicting thoughts.
Almost given human emotion.
Yeah, I mean, they say that it's supposed to be mimicking human emotion, but the way he is processing everything, the way that he's showing concerns. Here's the other question. So they have that chess match that they're going back and forth. Does Hal make a mistake?
Kind of. I don't know exactly if we're supposed to know that he does make a mistake there, but Stanley Kubrick was a chess master. He was a chess hustler in New York when he was younger. It's believed that he left the chess mistake in there for chess masters, because he would do that sort of thing. He would leave little things like that in the movie. That's one of the points where you can start to tell that Hal is having issues, and especially when he finally confronts Dave with the question if he thought things were weird about the mission too. Because it's like Hal wants to
understand.
He wants to understand, but he also wants to please. He wants to be liked. He does emulate the human emotion very well.
And it is interesting because I do think he has a special relationship with Dave, because he could have, later on in this movie, he could have killed Dave, just like he killed Frank. He basically went out there and had the pod clip his air tube that made him couldn't breathe, and he basically dies in space. But he doesn't do that to Dave. Keeps Dave alive and gives Dave that opportunity to actually sneak back in through the airlock, which Hal doesn't think he can do, but he does give him that opportunity instead of just killing him, because he has control of that pod. He could do whatever he wants to that pod.
He could probably shut the oxygen off in the pod if he really wanted to.
But he doesn't do it because I think he does care for Dave at a different level than everybody else.
Well, yeah, because Dave has a better relationship, because Frank is more, he doesn't treat Hal very well. He's very curt with Hal, and he treats Hal like a machine, whereas Dave actually treats him like a living, breathing person.
Like a member of the crew.
Yeah. Whereas like Frank in the pod, he's suggesting that we disconnect Hal. It's not the other way around. It's Frank that's basically throwing this, we should do this, we should do this, we should do this, and it's Dave reacting, yeah, we probably should. I think he looks at Frank as somebody that, like you said, doesn't believe he's an essential being per se. When Dave disconnects him, it's out of duty probably, but there is probably some type of little revenge going on here for the people that Hal ends up killing.
Well, yeah, you can see there's no emotion in it when he's disconnecting the memory from Hal, and Hal is pleading. There is no emotion whatsoever from Dave.
Until he asks Dave if he wants him to sing a song.
Right.
It seems like he feels bad for Hal at this point.
It's funny that you bring that particular section up. Kirdulia, in the commentary track, he mentions the point of essentially what Dave's doing to Hal. I don't know if you're familiar with Of Mice and Men, but that's Lenny essentially killing his friend because he says, "Tell me about the rabbits, George." It's George killing Lenny. He does view Hal as almost as a friend, and he thinks that that'll help distract Hal as he removes the last part of his logic.
Right, because he's pleading for his life. He's begging him to respond. He tells him to take basically a chill pill. So he's relating to him on a level of a friendship. Here's the question. Is Hal okay now at this particular point? Or is he trying to manipulate Dave to not disconnect him? Or is he okay at this point? Because we don't know, is Hal malfunctioning because the monolith maybe put something into his system and he was enlightened? Was it the two different orders and he realized that if this goes on to its logical conclusion, that maybe Hal would no longer be needed because man would now advance to the next level? There's so many different things here that could be coming into play. So it's a question of what happened to Hal.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Hal had a crisis, and I think all of those different things were going through Hal's mind or through his logic sensors at that point when he finally reached the tipping point where he had to ask Dave. He's almost essentially at that point, he's asking Dave for help when he says, "Do you get the feeling that there was something really weird about this whole mission?" And he's essentially asking for help. It's crazy because he is artificial intelligence. And like you said, did he reach another level of understanding through,
because it would be a radio signal that a computer probably would be able to catch. The only thing I don't understand is why does he kill the ones in suspended animation? They're no threat to him whatsoever, and he can keep them in that suspended animation if he's getting rid of Frank and Dave.
Well, he had already gotten rid of Frank at this point, correct?
Right.
So now he's got to cover up his tracks.
He's a murderer. He's covering up for himself.
And we don't know the relationship he had with the two people in suspense.
There's three people, actually.
Three people in suspense. We don't know the relationship he had with them. I think he's just covering up his tracks. He's developed human characteristics.
They don't know what's going on, though, because eventually he's going to go back to work with the humans. So I don't see the reason for the killing of the three. Maybe just part of the movie. Oh, he just killed three more people. You know, I think that's the only...
It's self-preservation.
But they're not a threat.
But once they do wake up, then they realize what he's done.
But he's in control of when they wake up. He doesn't have to wake them up until he gets back to Earth.
It's interesting you brought up the term self-preservation because when you said that, I immediately jumped back to Dawn of Man with them developing the skills now to kill. And now for them, it's self-preservation.
Yeah, that's a human trait. We always go for self-preservation. And that's a very human emotion that Hal's exhibiting because he knows that he's going to get shut off. If they wake up and Frank and Dave aren't there, he's going to get shut off.
Because Hal's claim to fame, if you will, is I never make a mistake. But yet he lied directly to try and cover stuff up.
Hal decides to kill instead of share Dave what's actually his orders are so he can give him more of an understanding. So it's interesting that he goes the killing route. And I think what happens here is he's still a computer. He says the logical thing here then is to kill. And then after he does the killing, I think he might be remorseful. I do think when he's having that conversation with Dave before he disconnects him, he's like, I'm doing better now. I made some mistakes.
Everything's good now.
Everything's good now. But he's still a computer, but I think he now reassessed everything and realized I could have did it differently. And maybe the differently would have been sharing with Dave the mission and why it concerns him.
He's trying to rationalize with Dave to not shut him off. Hal essentially becomes human, and then that can go into a Pinocchio type story. Where does Hal become human? Is that artificial intelligence's next advancement to become human? Because what you're describing is human in the self-preservation, but then rationalization. He's trying to rationalize why he acted the way he did, and he doesn't understand because he's still artificial intelligence. So he's like, oh, hey, I'm okay now. Hey, I've got it together. I had a moment, I had a breakdown, but hey, I'm okay now. And that's very human as well. You look at any murder trial and somebody trying to evade prison, he's like, hey, I did this crazy thing, but I'm okay now.
I'm feeling much better now.
Right.
And maybe it's in the moment. He kills Frank, and then he kills the ones in suspended animation, but then he doesn't kill Dave. Maybe it is that special relationship with Dave, but maybe it's also he's in the moment, and he's trying to self-preserve, and then he realizes after he does all this killing that he doesn't want to kill anymore.
That's very true. That could be another advancement of human intellect, essentially, too, to realize that weapons aren't the answer as well. That could definitely be what is trying to be expressed there. Hal, essentially, he becomes a human. I mean, it wouldn't be a stretch for the whole artificial intelligence becoming human. That theme is tackled a lot in the movie Artificial Intelligence, which was written fully by Stanley Kubrick, even though it was directed posthumously by Steven Spielberg. That theme is brought up again in that work, where the artificial intelligence becomes human, essentially, and wants to become human. But Hal does achieve another level of understanding.
I think it's interesting that the person who played the voice of Hal, I heard worked only 9 hours on this film, but he's essential because his voice is kind of got a creepy little vibe. It gets even more creepy as he's slowly deactivating him, and that voice is getting lower and lower.
Yeah.
He's singing the song Daisy. Do you want to hear me sing Daisy?
Yeah.
Sure, Hal. So give him credit. I don't know up to this point in 1968 how much a voice by itself contributed to a movie like this. There might be some out there, and I can't think of one.
No, I can't either.
It's very true. You're exactly right. It's amazing without expressing emotion in his voice, but you get so much out of it.
There's the pauses and there is the dialogue. And so all these different things that he's doing without changing his voice inflection is amazing on what he's doing. It's commonplace now. We have tons of movies that do it now, but in 1968, this is not common. Not at all.
No, you're right. It's not. So now Hal's been essentially turned off, and Dave continues on the mission, and that's when he encounters the final monolith that's in orbit around Jupiter. And that's where the movie enters its third and final phase, which is Jupiter and Beyond the Infinite.
To infinity and beyond.
Right. I guess to start to unpack this, what does Dave encounter with the monolith that's orbiting around Jupiter?
I think that's hard to say. I mean,
it's really hard to say.
I think Stanley Kubrick tries to display here is that's basically it. It's hard to understand. It's a level of understanding that we just don't know because it's something that we have to be enlightened to, and we're not enlightened to it yet. So everything that we're kind of seeing here is hard to kind of comprehend. Even for like Christians with God, people always say, and Eric will attest to this, we always talk about this, is that we don't understand fully God's motives, what God has in store for us. We just don't know until God reveals to us what's going on. And I think here we're left to determine ourselves. That's why there's so many theories out there of what's happening to Dave here. Is Dave still in the pod? Has he gone anywhere? Is he in a black hole? Is he in another dimension? What is going on? We don't know. And Stanley Kubrick doesn't want to tell us because he wants us to figure it out. Maybe Stanley Kubrick doesn't even know. So, especially when we get to the Star Baby, I have no clue what the Star Baby really is. All I know is it ends up on a David Bowie song later on.
It does. When he encounters the monolith, I have to say, Ken, that was brilliant the way you compared that as far as not knowing essentially what's there, and we can't comprehend it, because that was Kubrick's reasoning about not showing aliens, because you can't show where you can have no logical idea. And that's kind of what led to the monolith in itself. But it has to be something, because he travels to another galaxy, because what happens is essentially it bends time and
But does it? Is he going through the galaxy, or is this how enlightenment actually looks like? All of a sudden, all these things are thrown at you all at once, and then at the end, you kind of get a understanding of what just transpired. So I'm not even 100% sure that he's actually traveling into another dimension. This might be just how enlightenment might work inside of his head.
So he could be in the pod the whole time, and the monolith is just placing these images in his mind.
Exactly, because then he sees himself all in these different type of phases in his life at the end. Because we're the viewer, we're watching all this happen. But what if he's watching all this happen to him? He's seeing himself older and older and older and seeing how they all react. Maybe he doesn't go anywhere. This is just the way that the monolith enlightens him.
I've not looked at it from that perspective. And that makes actually probably more sense than what I've come to believe. It makes a lot of sense too, because I listened to Keir Dullea talk about, and the way he described what he thought, like you said, like they got into his brain, and to make the transition to the next level of advancement,
to make it comfortable, make it more rational. You know, kind of like I think I know what you're talking about there. He mentioned also that like when we take animals, we put them in a zoo. You know, we make their surroundings more comfortable.
And so they planted that on his brain. So he's still in the pod, but his brain is depicting it as something where he's in this room. Oh, I like that interpretation a lot.
Maybe he's tripping acid.
It's definitely something. Really,
you think of Dr. Haywood Floyd when he touches the monolith earlier on in the movie, and it seems like he might be given a revelation itself. But maybe he goes through the same process and sees what he needs to do to get to that next level. And that's why 18 months later, they're sent on this mission, because he is given this revelation, and he's taken that revelation and he's giving that to Dave, and then Dave gets to see the next revelation. And then there's the next revelation, and so on and so forth.
Was the extraterrestrial intelligence manipulating Hal and killing the other three scientists?
I think in that case that he manipulated Dr. Floyd, and Dr. Floyd manipulated Hal. And then that's why Hal was all messed up, because the order came from Dr. Floyd.
And so then Dave was essentially the chosen one.
Mm-hmm.
He was
possibly.
He was the person chosen to advance civilization to the next level.
We don't consider how big Dr. Floyd here is in making all these things happen. In my opinion, he has manipulated Hal, and because he knows how Hal is going to work, because he's a computer, and he has these two orders, and they're conflicting each other. And Hal doesn't understand how this all works. And it's very possible that Dr. Floyd already knows what is going to happen. He knows that there's going to be death. He knows all this is going to transpire, but he does it because of the fact that Dave is going to get the next revelation.
That's so interesting, because in Hal talks about the fact that all of the scientists were trained separately from each other and then put into hibernation before the launch. You've changed my perspective. I might actually have to go watch it again, because I never came at it from that point of view. But that makes more sense than a lot of different things, because we don't know what Dave encounters there, but we do know that Dave has changed.
That's the great thing about this movie, though, is it's open to interpretation. So this is my interpretation, but other people have different interpretations. And that's what I think Kubrick wants. He wants us to have fun with this. He wants us to debate this and have it talk about in coffee shops. And probably didn't think about podcasts at the time, but he wanted us to talk about this and it be a thing.
And I think that's part of the overall brilliance of the movie, because the man who played Frank, he said in the commentary track that at the very end that he's encountered people that don't like the movie. And he says, and then I've realized that I don't have a lot in common with them. And I think it's this part of the conversation that we're having. These are some pretty highly existential discussions for a movie discussion than we'll probably have the rest of the time we do the podcast. I mean, there's dealings with a lot of themes here that are just not tackled in other things. And I think people of like-minded intelligence can try to sort this out and come at it from the different perspectives. And I think that's part of the brilliance of the movie. So the Star Child.
The Star Child.
This is where a lot of people have problems with the movie, because they don't know what to make of the Star Child. Now,
then it's not a conclusive ending.
It's not. But we do know And I think for the basis of moving forward with our discussion, because I like the way what Ken's proposed a lot, that the Star Child is Dave reborn, essentially as, I hate to use this term, but
Like reincarnation?
not necessarily reincarnation, but new Dave. He's Dave of a higher intelligence. And it's almost like old Dave doesn't exist anymore. And that's the rebirth of Dave into the next level of existence. It's an interesting thought, and I hadn't looked at it from that perspective. What do you guys think the Star Child at the end represents?
I honestly don't know. It is so wide open. It could be anything. It could be reincarnation. It could be a do-over. It could be the dawn of a new beginning, the dawn of a new planet, the dawn of a new society beginning. Maybe the old society died off with Dave. Maybe that was the end. And now the monolith, the God figure, is starting over again. There's so many interpretations that can be done.
I think it's the next step of human beings. And I don't even think that necessarily we become the Star Child. I don't think that that's our physical look. That might be what the director wants, is showing us is it's a next level thing. Doesn't mean that we're all of a sudden a Star Child, but now we're at next level stuff.
Yeah. Everything with Kubrick, of course, is there for a reason. But the use of Thus Spake Zarathustra by Richard Strauss, it's very pointed, in my opinion, and it's deliberate, because Strauss wrote that as a companion to Nietzsche's book about Zarathustra, which talks about man versus Superman, or as it's called in German, the Übermensch, where the man has now achieved the next level. And if you look at the times where that piece of music is used, something dramatic has changed, and we have achieved another level of brain thought or existence. It makes sense that with the Star Child, we hit the climax of Thus Spake Zarathustra, where it explodes off the TV, essentially, through sound and picture. I think that's very interesting, but who would have thought today when we were recording this, we would be talking about Friedrich Nietzsche?
Exactly, right?
Because Nietzsche, he's been pigeonholed as a more of a nihilist type of a philosopher, but a lot of what he wrote, there has to be an influence on 2001, because ultimately, while Nietzsche comes off as nihilistic, he has a optimism for the future of humanity. And I think that that too comes off at the very end of the movie, where there's an optimism for the future. We've reached another level. To me, personally, it comes off ultimately positive. It's a positive feeling. I never have a negative feeling at the end of 2001. It's always a hopeful feeling that we're going to achieve the next plane of existence where maybe we can live in harmony. I don't know. There's a lot that can go into that, but it would be irresponsible of us to not at least mention the fact that Nietzsche and Strauss and Kubrick and then Clark as well, Kubrick and Clark fit Nietzsche and Strauss into this little ball that became 2001. And I think that that's what it leaves me at the end of the movie, is feeling hopeful. Does it leave you guys feeling hopeful as well?
Oh, yeah. The music alone makes you, with the visual and the music, it is a very uplifting, positive ending, if you will, even with the Star Child there, and it's kind of wide open to as it ends. But you do feel positive, especially after Dave dies. Now you're like, oh, Dave's dead. But then you see the vision of the Star Child and the music. The eyes are kind of looking, and he's looking at the planet. And it's very uplifting and very positive.
Is that Dave on the bed? I thought that was Deadpool.
Funny.
To me, it depends on how you come into the movie. I'm a Christian, so looking at something like this, based on the evolution and stuff, that Stanley Kubrick was probably an atheist, or at least he didn't believe in God in the sense of the biblical God, let's just say. So maybe at the end, you're just kind of weirded out by it. You're not sure what to think of it. I think when we have healthy discussions like we did today, we can draw it out a little bit more. But I think if you see this film by yourself and you don't have anybody to reference it, it's a hard movie to work with. Requires discussion.
No, you're very right. It has to be discussed. Or it doesn't necessarily have to be, but it begs for you to sit and have interesting conversation.
Which I think is what Kubrick wants. He wants you to really talk about this movie. He wants to talk about all his movies.
There seems to be always a thread of something that he wants to talk about
We could go on for a long period of time. If we didn't go by our own guidelines and how long we want our episodes to be, we could talk about this for a very long time. I would like to have talked about how they ate their food through a straw, just simple things like that. We didn't talk enough about the visual of this movie and how you have Frank jogging upside down and around. And there's so many cool things visually about this film that we didn't even get to touch base on, that we could spend another half an hour at least, talking about this. This is a
Very easily. Yeah.
beautifully filmed movie. I appreciate this movie for techniques that Kubrick used in this movie. It's amazing.
The creation of Discovery, where the centrifuge that he created at Pinewood Studios was amazing.
There is no CG in this movie whatsoever.
No.
Nothing.
It's before any of that was allowed. Even the Dawn of Man sequences, those are pictures that were taken. But they weren't just any pictures. He had a crew on the Serengeti in Africa taking those pictures and transmitting them back electronically to him so he could tell them where to move the camera and everything. That sort of thing is amazing. Most of those are still pictures.
I don't think a movie like this can be made today because this movie took 3 years to really get onto the screen.
And he ran out of money.
I don't think that you're going to have production companies, Walt Disney, Paramount, whatever the case may be, have patience for 3 years. And that's why I think this film comes off looking as great as it does, because he takes his time. He works hard on this movie, and he is looking for all these different ways to improve it. He gets NASA involved. He has the best people involved in this. I think he went to was it a World's Fair?
The 64 World's Fair.
Right, and this is where it all just started revving his engines on this.
Yeah, that, and he had read the short story The Sentinel by Arthur C. Clarke. This can go into our next level of our conversation, which is we barely even mentioned Arthur C. Clarke as far as his influence of the movie. Arthur C. Clarke was a science fiction author, and this was a true collaborative thing with Stanley Kubrick, whereas they're both credited for the writing of the script. But Arthur C. Clarke, you could almost call him a prophet. He predicted so many things, and the 2001 predicts and puts on the film so many things that have come to pass. But one of the interesting things about Arthur C. Clarke, he is the man who developed and came up with the idea for satellite technology. We wouldn't have cell phones or any of our mass communication devices if it wasn't for Arthur C. Clarke. And to the point where NASA and the world has described the orbit in which the satellites travel around the Earth is the Clarke Belt. And he's a truly fascinating person, and his influence on this movie is huge. He came from that time of Asimov and writers like that, and Philip K. Dick, where they were pushing the bounds of science fiction writing. No longer was it the childish type of dime store pulp novels that the science fiction had become. These men took it to a new level. You could put Vonnegut in there as well. He's truly interesting, and you can really tell that through 2001. You look at some of the things that they predicted that were going to come out, or what they put onto film that ended up becoming reality. There's a video phone. That's something we take for granted now. Nobody would have thought that back when they were doing this. You have voice recognition software. That's how Haywood Floyd identifies himself. And then you have artificial intelligence. You have a laser printer. Hal prints off the diagnostics. And you have advanced robotics. But then, interestingly enough, the iPad and the tablet, because that's what Frank and Dave watched the BBC report on. I also found this interesting that when Samsung sued Apple over the iPad and the tablet and the design, and Apple actually mentioned in their defense for that lawsuit, they mentioned 2001 and how they designed the iPad basically off of what 2001 was. That's what makes this truly a visionary piece, in my opinion.
So what I would say about the technology base, in some aspects, I feel like we're disappointed that we're not at a certain level that this movie thinks we should be at 2001. There are things like the iPad, tablets, and things of that nature that we do have, video conferencing, software recognition, but it's kind of limited. Whereas in 2001, we're traveling to Jupiter. Heck, we stopped going to the moon like decades ago. Our space exploration nobody even talks about it. And maybe that's something that we as a world need to invest back into, maybe promote a little bit more unity in our culture as far as finding ways to better man by exploring what's out there. So when I watch this movie, I'm a little bit bummed that we're not further along than what the writers here in 1965 to 1968 here our thinking, it's basically a disappointment for me.
I see. I'm the opposite. I'm not disappointed at all. I watched this movie and I'm blown away by it. I'm blown away by the visual effects. I'm blown away about the predictions of items that they see in 2001. I don't think we had iPads in 2001. I think those came out a little later, but it is kind of cool just to watch Stanley Kubrick's vision and his people that are working with him, their vision of what the future is going to look like. And a lot of the stuff is pretty accurate, pretty close. And yeah, I'm a little disappointed we don't have space travel. That would be a commercial space travel where anyone can fly around wherever without an issue. But technically, we're supposed to have flying cars too, right? That never occurred. Right now, we're just breaking into electric cars as being pretty prominent. It's amazing how things kind of did not go as far as they thought. But at that time, things were going so fast in the space race in the 60s that realistically, this could have been an option.
I think it was the space shuttle in 84?
The Challenger? Challenger was January 86.
So the Challenger of 86, I think, stopped us from exploring further. At least that's what it looks like. Because after 86, we really are not doing much out there. We haven't visited the moon. We're very limited to even what we've done with Mars and beyond. It's kind of interesting that all of a sudden everything kind of stopped. Maybe we found a monolith.
Visit the quote-unquote moon. Yes.
There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there as far as whether or not we actually landed on the moon.
And did Kubrick help with that?
Well,
who knows? That'll
be discussed during our Shining.
Stay tuned, folks. Stay tuned.
But yes, it is theorized that Stanley Kubrick did help NASA film the moon landing.
Well, what does that say to us about our technology then? If he did, then we are so far behind what they thought we were supposed to.
Which is why I don't buy those theories. But I agree with you, Ken. It does leave me wishing that we would have continued along that path. And this leads to the influence that this movie's had. When we first started talking, Eric, you had mentioned the influence of just pretty much every major
sci-fi director, of course. George Lucas,
Ridley Scott, Spielberg, Christopher Nolan,
James Cameron, all of them.
James Cameron, I'm sorry.
And this is the reason why Star Trek even got rebooted, because of the success of 2001.
Yep, that's where I was going, because I look at 2001 and I see Star Wars all over it. I see Star Trek all over it. And if you take a movie like Christopher Nolan's Interstellar, which in my opinion is almost a modern day take on 2001: A Space Odyssey.
That's a good point. Exactly.
With more dialogue.
With more dialogue, with more physics dialogue. You can't deny the influence. I think that's where 2001 too almost... I don't hate the use of the word science fiction, but because of course it is science fiction, but to me it's almost more science fact, where it's a different science fiction than Star Wars. Star Wars is space fantasy, but 2001 lives in a realm of possibility. And I know I tease about Star Trek, but Star Trek dances on that line. And it's a very thin line, but it takes that line very seriously, where it straddles that line of fantasy, but also fact. Because if you look at a lot of the things that come out of the Star Trek universe that have been practical and have been used in our society today, it's almost like 2001. There's a lot there. Whereas Star Wars has a few things, but the story itself is more fantasy. This movie changed science fiction. There's science fiction before 2001.
But it was all campy and hokey. And
exactly.
It was all, everything was a UFO spaceship and aliens coming down and very campy.
There's a handful of exceptions in there, but you're exactly right. That's exactly what it was. Then after 2001, it completely shattered and changed everything. It changed the entire genre. We don't see movies hardly anymore that are so earth-shattering to an entire genre of movies that they're never the same afterwards. You can't look at a science fiction movie now since that doesn't have some sort of a tie to it. Ken, you had mentioned about NASA. Pinewood Studios was called NASA East. The things that they were developing and doing there, NASA scientists were amazed by what they were doing. And Neil Armstrong has even commented prior to his death, after he came back from the first moon mission,
quote unquote,
right, came back and said, 2001 is right. Everything does move slowly in space. And we barely even got to touch on that, but the use of the Blue Danube waltz as the movement of space, I think really portrays that as everything is deliberate in space. I find that fascinating.
You sounded like Spock there for a minute.
Live long and prosper.
I find it highly illogical, Captain.
Uh-oh, Star Trek trying to take over Ted now.
Am I completely off base?
No, you're 100% on. The spinning spaceship was creating artificial gravity stream,
Right.
which I thought was real, was what they wanted to portray, which I thought was really cool. And some of the commentators like, I don't know why NASA didn't pursue that.
It's those details. The mind is blown. And I think that that's why when critics first saw the movie, they couldn't comprehend what they were watching.
Because there was nothing before it to compare it to.
Right. This shattered everything. And that's why it's so seminal. So as we're wrapping up here, why don't we give our final opinions and grade for the movie? You want to go first, Eric?
All right. So 2001, A Space Odyssey. I have to say, if you are going to watch this movie, I highly recommend it minimum in Blu-ray. And Ted, you can recommend the 4K.
Yes.
Incredible. The restoration from the Blu-ray to the DVD, it is a completely different movie. You really see the visual special effects up close and personal, and you really feel like you're there. It is just an incredible remaster of the original film. In reviewing this, the visuals are groundbreaking. They are revolutionary. They have set the tone for all sci-fi movies made since 1968. And I would say that even some of the movies made in the last 10 years, special effects wise with the CG, don't even compare to the cinematography on this. I mean, it is just incredible. The use of music in this movie is used perfectly. Like you said, with the waltz and the slowness and space and deliberateness, everything is placed perfectly because Stanley Kubrick is a perfectionist. And the way he wants this movie is the way he wants this movie. Everything is what he wanted. Unfortunately, he said he ran out of money. There was probably a few things they would have done in the ending. Who knows? But you get what you get. So when it comes to the cinematography, the visual, the music, the score, I give this an A+. Unequivocally, it is just top tier. When it comes to the movie itself, when it comes to the acting, when it comes to the time, I got to go a little bit lower. It does drag a little bit. It does have obviously times where there's no dialogue. It is a little slow. The mind can wander a little bit on it. I give it a little bit of a lower grade. I give it kind of like maybe a C, C+. So overall, you blend them together. I give this movie a solid B+.
Alrighty, Eric. And Ken?
Well, it's very interesting that Eric went and graded it kind of like a 2-tier, and I kind of feel the same way because I'm dragged into two different ways of wanting to grade this film. When I watched it so many years ago by myself as a young, early 20s man, couldn't stand this film. Didn't like it whatsoever. It bored me to tears. I'm happy to have rewatched it a couple times. To a certain extent, that same feeling, though, is there. The beginning of the movie, there's no dialogue for the first 20 minutes. I talked about using a stopwatch on that. There's certain things that kind of annoy me, like certain sounds.
Ken was saying that the use of some of the loud music, the loud squeals, the loud sound effects were kind of daunting and threw you off. And I guess someone who's sensitive to loud sounds like that could be thrown off from the movie.
Even my dog was thrown off. He thought the fire alarm was going off.
So was our dog.
My wife's like, can't you shut that thing off? There were times where my wife was annoyed by what I was watching, and she wasn't in the same room. She's in another room, but she can hear it, and she's like, what is that awful sound? So as far as if you're looking at for like entertainment value, like if you were just going to go to the movie theater and watch this, I would probably rate this somewhere around a D+. If you were just doing that for a popcorn blockbuster type of movie, that's what you were looking for. That's the type of grade I'd give it. But he does such a beautiful job with the cinematography. He does just a great job of the visual effects. It's beautifully done. It really is. But you have to be a certain type of person There's people that for instance, like to go to the art museum and look at pieces of art, and they can spend hours and hours in an art museum and appreciate the work of art. And then you have people that maybe go to a different type of museum, maybe Science and Industry in Chicago, need to see things physically move around and do things for that to happen. And I'm kind of that later part there. I'm kind of somebody that needs to see more things happen. Even in this movie, when there is dialogue and we do have interaction, everything takes its sweet time. Talk about when Frank is in space, his air's been cut off, and Dave goes out and tries to get him and bring him back. It takes forever. It takes a long period of time. Stanley Kubrick doesn't try to quickly mesh things together. He doesn't mind that it takes a long time for this to happen. And because of this, I'm starting to lose interest again. To sum everything up, this movie for me is a C+. I want to give it a better grade because this discussion in itself makes me want to give it a high grade because it's fun to talk about. It's enjoyable to debate about and have conversations of. But as far as just sitting down and enjoying a movie in itself, it's boring. It's not fun to watch it at the time. It's great to discuss it afterwards, but the actual movie experience at that moment, I don't think it's a fun one.
I appreciate what you have to say, Ken, and I guess I'll finish up here. My opinion of the movie, and it's no secret, this is a top 10 movie for me, almost close to the top 5. I've never found it boring. I don't find it tedious. It always keeps my attention. And I know everything's done deliberately. It is a piece of art. We had discussed in the teaser that Kubrick's movies can sometimes be very art-like. To me, this movie changed my life, quite literally. I mean, I can look at how I looked at movies before 2001 and I can look at them after. It's provided me with hours and hours of enjoyment. I'm never not entertained by it. The use of the music, and I think maybe part of it too, is looking up stuff afterwards, looking at connections between the music and the theories of different philosophies that went into making the movie. That all plays a part, I guess, into it. I've been lucky enough to see this movie on the big screen. That experience was unlike any other movie experience I've ever had, and I was almost moved to tears. I can't explain what it did. It's amazing. I'm always in awe of the movie. It's influenced every major science fiction movie that I love afterwards. And without this, they might not exist. So when I look at this, if I could give above an A+, I would, because of what it means to me. And I can't separate myself out of giving that grade. You just can't, because the movie means so much to me. So that's where I land. I think we had an amazing discussion. I think if you're going to go watch this movie, see it with friends and then have a discussion afterwards.
See it in high def. See it in 4K,
yes,
or Blu-ray.
4K.
Don't do a crummy download or anything like that.
No.
You got to see this thing in it and see it in its entirety. Do not break it up.
Right. And see it with some friends, because that's what Stanley and Arthur would have wanted you to talk about this, discuss things, and maybe that's our next level of evolution. We'll close it with that, Ken and Eric.
What's coming up next, Ted?
The next movie that we're going to be reviewing of Stanley Kubrick's is going to be The Shining.
That's going to be a fun one to discuss.
That's going to be real fun.
And then on top of that, I believe we're going to be reviewing the documentary 237.
That will definitely be included in our discussion of The Shining. I guarantee you that.
It's been a fun discussion. It really has been. I've really enjoyed it. And I understand why you guys gave that high grade. If I were to grade it just on how beautiful this movie is, I would give it an A as well. This has been a fun discussion.
Ted, you made a great point. Like, my favorite movie of all time, and I am not a sci-fi person by any stretch of the imagination, but Close Encounters of the Third Kind is my favorite movie of all time. There is no way this movie could have been made without that. None.
Right. You're exactly right. Mm-hmm. All righty, guys.
Okay.
So I think we've ended our discussion of 2001. So yes. I will see you at the movies.
All right. Everybody take care.
See ya.